Ja suur tänu Lillele ja küll on hea, kui ei pea järgmist esinejat tutvustama. Amit Goswami, hurraa!
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. Okay, so this morning subject is okay. This morning's subject is the main subject of the workshop. Quantum activism, what is that? I already have defined that yesterday, I think, but we can repeat. It's to bring the quantum worldview in our living. A quantum activist thinks, lives, and also tries to make a living in accordance with the principles of quantum worldview. And in the process, the consciousness of the quantum activist increases. So the next item, which is activism for activists who don't try to have a inner growth program, for them it's activism, it's work. But for a quantum activist, what happens is that the consciousness expands. Your sense of who you are becomes different. I myself am a good example of it. When I was a university professor, every lecture I would give would be work. And now I give so many lectures in a year, and I mean, it may sound a little peculiar, but it does not seem to be work. It's fun, it's friendship, it's love, it's all kinds of things, but I would call it work. How does the change happen? Your sense of self becomes different. When you don't look at an audience as the other, the whole thing changes. It's like sitting with your family talking stuff that is of mutual interest. You all want to know how to grow personally. I also want to know how to grow personally. We are just sharing our experience. That's what it is about. How does one get from the constricted consciousness to the expanded consciousness, which include others? This is, of course, the part which we have to listen carefully and learn the basic rudiments. Some aspects of it are already clear because spiritual traditions have been around for quite some time. Religions complicate things a bit. What the religions do, they have some useful things they have inherited from the spiritual traditions, but unfortunately, then they put some dogmatic stuff that is special to that religion, and the issues become a bit complicated. On top of it, today we have two worldviews. There is also the scientific materialist point of view, where this inner journey, consciousness, all these things are extremely iffy and murky. They really literally maintain that basically human beings are machines. So that confuses everyone. So let's go over a little bit of what it means to live like a machine and why so many people think that we are. Because we do live like that. I mean, there is a tendency in everyone to live like a machine. And this is the problem. Indeed, what happens is that the quantum equations of movement, which gives you possibilities, and therefore you have the prerogative of choosing freely from all the possibilities that are available to you. That situation that is truly available to us in principle doesn't stay that way. Why? Because the whole point of ego development is to provide us with certain expertise. And as we learn, we limit ourselves. We become conditioned to behave in a certain way. And these certain ways, if we are so lucky, then our upbringing will be such that there will be a lot of openness. Our parents will constantly warn us that, look, you're just developing expertise, but don't close your mind to things which are not necessarily confined to what you have learned already. There are things in heaven and earth which you don't know. Now, unfortunately, if a kid does not have that kind of good fortune, and the parents are also very complacent in terms of ego is enough, what we have learned is already enough, then we have really a problem. It produces a kind of a closed-mindedness. I already have what I need, and why should I learn more? The basic point of life, of course, is that we have infinite potentiality and we should never stop exploring. But if that is not emphasized by the culture, if that is not emphasized by the educational system, that is not emphasized by the parents, the kids are in real trouble. So what happens today, and sometimes technology. Technology basically is not bad per se. Anyone who has any grievance about technology, the grievance is wrongly placed. It's not technology to be blamed, it's how we use the technology. Why we do not understand that the technology can be used both in a good way and also in a bad way. This is the problem. So what has happened all over the world, unaware mostly by the culture and the society. What has happened is that our kids have become very non-human, machine-oriented. So let me go to my favorite medium, where I think better. So the journey, basically, if it is open, then we have learned how to take care of things outside of us, and then we turn inward. So this turning inward is the journey of personal growth. However, we are different in the sense that the spiritual traditions only emphasize turning inward. They did not recognize that the outside world is also important. The reason we turn inward is not that inward is the end of it all. The inward journey is necessary to grow personally, because there are some problems in here that enables, that prevents us from accomplishing. And what we are trying to do is to overcome those inner situations. So we turn inwards not to neglect the outward, not that the world is bad. The world is the thing. So quantum activist attitude is very different than the traditional spiritual journey. We journey of personal growth. Why? Because if I grow personally, I can serve the world better. Serve outer world better. Okay? So we don't get into that inner is better than outer and all that. Instead, we say that there is a dichotomy, inner-outer dichotomy. We must integrate. We say inner-outer integration. Okay. So wherever there is a division in the older thinking, the quantum thinking is that integration will allow us to optimize our situation, our abilities, our growth, our potentialities will come to fruition more and more and more and more. Okay? Now the question, of course, is that, all right, so what does this entail in our journey? We look at the inner experiences. The primary one, of course, is thinking. And the second thing that attracts our attention is emotions. Now, there are two kinds which we become very quickly aware. One is the negative kind, and one is what we call pleasure. Right? Negative emotions, we become very quickly aware of it. Right? Why do we call them negative? Because invariably the experience will constrict consciousness. So our definition of negative positive is very simple. It's not like dislike so much. That's the usual definition. Negative is something that I dislike, I keep away from it, and positive is something that I like. For us, it's a bit different. Then please learn to distinguish it this way. Because if you do, you will certainly be able to do better in the world. The criterion is not what I like or what I dislike. That's a mental, emotional thing. The criterion is my consciousness expanding if I'm doing this, or is it contracting? Does anger always contract? No. Anger does not always contract. Anger can expand. If you are angry against injustice, you'll find that your consciousness is expanded. You're trying to help somebody. And of course you're angry. That's called righteous anger. You're right. You're trying to make something that has been wrong. You're trying to make it right. That anger certainly expands your consciousness, does not contract you. So just because it's conventionally like dislike, nobody likes to be angry because it certainly upsets you, but that's not the criterion for choosing. We can use the negative emotions also for expanding. For example, the sad song that we often hear to inspire ourselves. Isn't that amazing? Why we sometimes go and see a tragedy in the theater, Shakespearean tragedy, some of them, because they indeed uplift us. Sad thing, but it's uplifting us. Interesting, isn't it? Because whereas comedy, often if it is a frivolous one, it does not uplift us. So like, dislike is not really a very good criterion of things. So is my consciousness expanding or is it contracting? Okay. But what about the thinking? Thinking also has subtlety. We went through that yesterday. Thinking has meaning. Meaningful thinking, or thinking can be just information. What's the difference? Information is other people's meaning. Other people's meaning. You have come to a workshop. I'm talking, you are mostly listening. You're getting another person's meaning, right? So what is the difference between treating it as information and treating it as meaning? This is a very, very important thing, and this is what today's kids have forgotten. Your generation probably has not forgotten. You know what to do. When you encounter another person's meaning, what you do is you give your own meaning. You compare that to your own belief system, and you examine, okay, is it okay with my belief system? If it's not, you examine it, and you examine it to see if your belief system will get better by absorbing this particular meaning in it, or if it gets worse. Worse meaning worse and better. What is the criterion? A good belief system will not give you conflict. Conflict is what you avoid. So if it creates too much conflict, that is something that usually people reject. Does not mean that would not be a good thing. Sometimes a conflict is necessary. The belief system is so bad that you have to really revolutionize your belief system. That can happen too. But in the process of examination, by asking this question, is this new information, how does it fit in with my belief system? What you are doing, you are giving your own meaning to the other person's meaning. This is where information becomes meaning. To try to understand and accommodate in our own belief system. This process is called understanding, right? Understanding means the ability of looking at it from both sides. I look at it as information, neutral. I also look at it as what would happen if I absorb this idea in my belief system. Try to accommodate this. What kind of change do I have to encounter? And in that process, something happens, which is your ability to look at it from a personal point of view as well as an objective point of view. Your personal meaning is entering the picture. This is how we process meaning. This is how it has always been. The education really is a journey in meaning. That is what is called liberal education. By absorbing education, you become liberated from the kind of dogmatic thinking that you have become used to, that ego dies. Everybody has an ego, and the ego says that what I know is enough. Why should I learn any more? Then you encounter ideas and you find, oh, this will make my life better. Oh, this will make me more affluent. Oh, this will enable me to have relationships, right? And this is how we become curious and we continue learning. But if we don't see meaning in the information we are getting, what then? What happened to a very large generation of kids is that they started using technology, namely computers and cell phones, to avoid boredom. To avoid a mild form of suffering that is called boredom. Before, what happened was that people approached meaning with something that we call curiosity. Today, kids approach meaning from something called boredom. Your generation don't relate to this very much. Are you here for the entire weekend because you are bored otherwise? Anyone? No, you wouldn't think of it. But this generation does, the current generation, current teenagers and people in their 20s, they really would do things. They would not come to things like this, of course, but they would do things just to avoid boredom. And the motivation, since it's just to avoid boredom, they just process information, but with never thinking of incorporating that in their belief system, in how they think, how they live. That equation will not enter. And so the brain doesn't cooperate very much with that. What happens is that the brain can memorize, memory will be made, but you cannot retrieve that memory because you are not going over it. In the process of understanding, we use the brain. We go over it again and again. That's the way we try to understand. That also helps memorize, because more we recall, the more the memory is reinforced. Recalling becomes easy. So the whole process is to work in favor of both our self and also the brain was functioning normally. And now the brain doesn't function normally anymore, because brain has a lot of memories, but it cannot retrieve it because there is no emotion put into it. This information is being collected with a very disgruntled state of mind. No passion in it. Curiosity gives passion into something. This doesn't. The opposite. I'm bored. The energy just is not there. I told you about Alzheimer yesterday. That's a health question. We won't get into health questions very much. Today is the day for positivity. But this we need to avoid. Boredom is very inadequate motivation for learning, and hardly any learning happens when we do something because we are just bored. Avoid boredom. So this is not the approach. A quantum activist approach to life is curiosity. Unfortunately, of course, we are human beings, so although boredom is not to be encouraged, suffering itself, not mild suffering like boredom, but heavy suffering, suffering heavy, that happens sometimes. Life has become so unhappy, like for me, it was like that. And many great investigators of life had suffering as a initiator. That happens. But not this kind of suffering. Suffering. So then how should we look at suffering? The attitude towards suffering, again, it's a choice. If suffering is happening, we can look at as, okay, this is bad. That's one way of looking at it. Suffering is bad. I'm suffering. Oh my God, it's bad. Or I can say it's an opportunity for making changes. Like the inspired thought that came to me. Why do I live this way? I realized that it's my choice. I have chosen this suffering. Why should I choose suffering? Why don't I see if I can choose happiness instead? It's very simple. Like that woman who took the LSD trip. Health, life, or death? Sometimes it presents so simply. So simply. The crisis leads us to that moment where the choice becomes clear. Suffering or happiness? What do we choose? Life or death? What do we choose? Positive or negative? What do we choose? So suffering can lead to this crossroads where our choice becomes so clear. And obviously, when that happens, more or less everyone chooses the positive. When that crisis happens, hardly anybody would be crushed by the crisis. The reason crisis is happening is precisely we're ready for the crisis. So these events are called synchronicity. That's Carl Jung's term. He noticed that people in the journey of transformation often would have events which would open up a new path for them. Synchronicities are big hints of what should be my direction. Where should I go? And it comes like this. The choice is clear. And in those moments, it is clear that I have been choosing unnecessarily the stuff that makes me unhappy, that makes me suffer. I don't have to. That's the realization. Okay? So either way, curiosity is, of course, the best way. I'm naturally curious. What would happen if I explore? That's curiosity. Why should I stop exploring? That's curiosity. We maintain the curiosity. So if education is proper, then the curiosity, once kindled, would never stop. Why does our curiosity stop? Because our society has not learned how to educate without conflicts. This is where one aspect of our life that has to be talked about, and you have to remember, because this thing happened because of Europeans, basically, but not you. Don't take it personally. The Europeans of another generation, much before you, in the 17th, 18th, 16th, beginning around that time, Europeans had a huge technological superiority compared to rest of the world. And because of that technological superiority, they now could send a shipload of soldiers to another country and then subjugate that country, taking advantage of the country's divisions, which is natural. No countries in the old learned how to live peacefully with each other. So these foreign cultures, more technologically advanced, they could maintain a constant pressure because they themselves are not engaged. You see the advantage. So this is the idea of colonization. Where does it come from? Why were they motivated? They were motivated by that negative emotion that exists in the brain, everybody's brain, including the colonized. Don't exempt them. They have their own fault. So they just had the technology to use to be able to colonize. When they colonized the culture, naturally they would serve their purpose. After all, I am the conqueror, so these people are subjugated. and they should do my bidding. That's natural human thinking. And so they created the concept of job. Job. It's a little bit like slavery. It's an advanced level of slavery. In the olden days, when Romans conquered a lot of the world, or when the Greeks conquered a lot of the world, then they had the concept of slavery. They would subjugate a person completely, and the person does job for me, but person also doesn't have any freedom. You know about that. So we got rid of slavery by the time the modern Europeans started conquering the rest of the world. But the idea was still the same. These are subjugated inferior people, they should work for me, work for us. So they created the concept of job. This is so different than the usual form of occupation that people did before that. Before then, what happened was people had skills, and those skills served their personal growth. Some people would have skills in creating music. Some people would have skills in science and technology. Some people would have skill in teaching. Some people would have skill in arts. So every person really were occupied with something that they pursue meaningfully, purposefully, their own purpose, their own meaning. That changed into doing a job for another so that we can earn a living. Those people who were artisans and did their own thing, they also earned a living, but they liked what they were doing. This job concept was that you don't like what you're doing because you are working for me, you're not working for yourself. But you will be given money that will allow you to live. But at least you are not a slave. You have freedom. You can do anything you like with the money. But of course, if you don't like something and you do it all day, have you noticed you get mentally tired? The very thing that I was saying. Why can I give lectures all over the world and not get tired? Because I like what I do. And you like what I do. So you give me energy so I don't get tired. But if you do a job for somebody else, you get tired. And then what do you do with your money? You just entertain yourself. You feed yourself, of course, first, and then the rest of the money you entertain yourself. This is the way that society was for those colonized countries. And guess what? When these cultures started expanding, when industrial revolution came, a little bit after colonization began, and then all of a sudden, these cultures themselves needed huge number of people as laborers. Part of the industrial revolution also needed a whole bunch of people to do very routine work, part of the nature of the beast, modern industry. They required mechanical jobs, and the concept was created of giving them these mechanical jobs. The same thing that we are doing with the colonies, they now started doing in their own culture, by necessity. This is how people started doing jobs. Even professionals, they have a little bit of entry-level curiosity, do I like this or not? Schools routinely do a little bit of examination, okay, what is your propensity, what would you like to do? But in effect, how do we choose the profession? We ask questions like, well, will this give me enough money? That's our first criteria. Not, will this give me satisfaction? Will this give me meaning? Will this give me purpose of life? Most of us don't get that opportunity. Instead, our criterion is, will this give me enough money so that I can have a family, so that I can entertain myself, so that I can eat and live properly? All those criteria. Very different from, will this make me happy? Will this satisfy me? See how we went from the old culture to this new culture? So what am I getting at? What I'm getting at is that human beings are not this way. This is all has been artificial in modern times. When you pursue meaning, very soon you come across the idea that meaning is best served by a certain quantities which you don't quite know what they are, but they give us the highest context of meaning, this concept of context of meaning. Higher context of meaning. What does one mean by that? Well, I can give meaning to this. This is something that could be meaningful. If I don't know what this is, it would be an interesting search. Okay, is this water? Will it quench my thirst? Or is it something else? I have no idea, so I investigate. That's one kind of meaning that I can investigate. I can also investigate the meaning of somebody's emotion. Somebody looks angry. That I can investigate, is it really anger or is it fake anger? Sometimes people fake anger because they are trying to manipulate me. That's another kind of meaning I can try to give. But those are trivia. Then we can look at meaning of meaning. I can just look at rational thinking. Okay, so I am now listening to Amit Goswami, and he is talking about meaning, and let's see what the meaning of that is. Meaning of meaning. I can go in that direction. Those are all ultimately meaning of known stuff. It's not going to teach me anything new. So human beings always have known that. Where does our inspiration for life come from? Not in these meanings, not in the meaning of, yes, they're useful. I do need to know. I live with someone, my partner, and I do need to know what the meaning of her or his emotions are. They are not trivial, agreed. Nevertheless, there are other stuff. This stuff we don't quite know what they are, but they set the highest context of our meaning. Even when we have relationship with people, I have this relationship with my partner, even then, the highest question that we sometimes ask is a question that we don't know what it means. Does she love me? Does he love me? Do I love her? Do I love him? What is love? We don't even know. See the peculiarity? But we have an intuition. This is where we use the word, intuition. We intuit that there are these valuable concepts. We don't quite know what they are. And this is why many people even doubt if intuition is a genuine, authentic experience independent of the meaning and feeling that comes with it. We don't intuit as a separate experience. We have intuitive thought, we have intuitive feeling. So intuition is something which is very easy to misinterpret or misunderstand, or completely avoid, completely negate that such things don't exist. Because we really do not have the capacity of making direct representation. That's a scientific way of putting it. Thinking we can memorize in the brain. We can look at thinking again and again. But we cannot do that with intuition. And intuition comes and we cannot recall. We can recall the intuitive thought, but we cannot recall that event of intuition. This is the peculiarity, because we cannot memorize the intuition directly. We can only memorize the thought that came with it. We can memorize the feeling that came with it. And we can remember those feelings and thoughts. But that only confuses us. Confuses us because we don't quite understand. Okay? However, nevertheless, is this intuitions that gives us the highest meanings and highest feelings. Love, beauty, justice, truth, goodness, all these concepts that we have, concept based on intuition. Intuition that if we follow this thing, it will expand my consciousness. That's the intuition. If we follow this thing, Jesus put it very well in the Bible. Seek and you shall find. And when you find, you will be troubled. You will be troubled why? Because you know that this is an important event. It has truth value. But you don't know what it is. Very peculiar feeling. I know I should pursue this, but what is it? I don't really know. Intuition does that to us. And yet, if we follow up the trouble, and following up, culture can help a little bit by naming them. If it is in connection with the relationship where sexuality is involved, then we can say, well, all right, the intuitive entity, quantity is love. If it is another being but no sexuality is involved, we can say, okay, we are looking for, should I be good to the person? Goodness. Or fairness, justice. If it is nature, beauty. Other situations are a little bit more clear because they are connected with survival. For example, I am interested in making money. And I can start with greed. Greed is a negative emotion built into the brain. That's one motivation. Okay, I want money, I need to make money. But that's not the motivation for everyone. People also get motivated by intuition. What kind of intuition? I am always wanting things. Can I have abundance? I'm always wanting things. Can I stop wanting? Can I have so much that I won't want anymore and relieve my time? Because wanting is not a very pleasant experience, always wanting. Makes you dissatisfied, right? Can I be satisfied with what I have? Can I have enough so that it will satisfy me? Abundance. That is also the same kind of thing as you're looking for, like love, justice, abundance. If I had abundance, I'll be satisfied. If I had love, I'll be satisfied. That's the intuition. Satisfied meaning what? My consciousness remain expanded, and that's what I want. Wouldn't every one of us want to live in an expanded consciousness all the time, right? What allows a person to live in an expanded consciousness? Always satisfied. If I had a sense of abundance, we feel that, yeah, that's the intuition. That will give me satisfaction always. I won't have this wanting all the time. Similarly, another concept that comes in the same vein is power. We want to get things done and we feel so helpless, I cannot do this. I cannot do this. Instead, if we had the ability, the inspiration to do it, the power to do it, again we are intuiting that, yeah, it is possible to have that sense of power. Now notice every one of these things also can be construed in a negative way, especially the last two, power and abundance. That archetypes, same vein as love, beauty, truth, we give the name archetypes for all of these things. What we intuit, we call them archetypes. Archetypes are the objects of intuition. Abundance and power are also archetype. But we can be motivated for the wrong reason. Just as abundance, we can be motivated for money, greed. Similarly, power, we can be motivated for a negative reason, domination. I want power because I want to dominate others. So archetypes can be that way, which serves negative emotion. Okay? Very important to recognize. And then other archetypes will elevate us. They don't have much to do with negative emotion. They are more uplifting. So in this way, we have a gradation of the archetypes that we go through. We start with abundance, power. Those are survival level archetypes. And then we have archetypes which will liberate us from the survival level of negative use of these things. Those archetypes are goodness, love. These two archetypes are very wonderful for humanity to pursue because they make power and abundance into positive, uplifting archetypes. Abundance, if it comes with goodness, I can share my abundance with somebody else. If power comes with goodness or love, I can similarly empower. If I love someone, I would not only use my power to my benefit, my advantage, but also empower the person I love. Right? And then there are archetypes which are a bit different. Truth, beauty, and justice. They're somewhat neutral, and they're very much pursued by people who are not motivated by this kind of thing much at all, but some sort of inner motivation. Scientists, they pursue truth. People who are spiritual, they pursue truth. They want to know what is the nature of the self. Scientists pursue what is the nature of the world. What laws govern the world. Artists pursue beauty. And justice, this again is a very specialized archetype which some people are very motivated by. How can one establish fairness in the world? They want to see fairness, justice served. And then the highest archetypes are, one is called wholeness and the other one is called self. Of this, the wholeness archetype is the archetype that is primarily interesting to a quantum activist. Self-archetype is the archetype that spiritual traditions have always pursued. Who am I? But self-archetype has a pitfall. Self exists in two forms in the brain: ego, result of memory, and the initial representation of consciousness in the brain, which we call quantum self. We talked about that yesterday. But I already mentioned, if you give up the ego and go into the quantum self, wonderful, called enlightenment, justifiably, because you are absolutely expanded, maximum capacity expansion, cannot be any better than that, except that there's nobody left to enjoy it. So you cannot serve the world that way. You have to have the ego. So people who enlighten, they stop short a little bit and serve the world anyway in the capacity of teaching. But still, they really are very detached from it all. Is that bad? No. They serve a huge purpose. Nothing is bad about that. But on the other hand, because they are not attached at all, therefore it really doesn't matter to them whether the world progresses or not. Really doesn't matter. So spiritual enlightened people confuse us quite a bit. They would say things like, oh, if the world goes, it's okay. It will still be okay. You say global warming, it's just destroying us. Terrorism, destroying us. They are not concerned. I said, only look for the self. Who are you? Why are you concerned about global warming? Why are you concerned about climate change? Do you think it matters? Ultimately, only expansion matters. Very confusing people. On the other hand, if we go for the archetype of wholeness, it's kind of have that quality of having your cake and also eating it. Eating it in the sense that you get to be whole. You get to be whole, no division, conflicts, so we are completely healthy, radiant, mental, physical health, sense of abundance, sense of power, also the ability of sharing your abundance and power. The kind of things that you are abundant in, you can share without worrying about zero-sum game, because they are infinite. You can give any amount of love to people and does not exhaust your love. Your capacity to love only increases, not decrease. Right? So, the wholeness is the archetype of choice for quantum activists. First of all, quantum activists recognizes that archetypes are important to have in our life. And second of all, which archetypes? Of course, if we have not gone through the low-level archetypes, we will be hankering for them too. So you have to be careful here. You cannot be premature. If you are into abundance, you are a business person, then you should pursue abundance. But you should always have the other archetype that will elevate you. That choice should be wholeness. Because wholeness is an archetype that allows you to be expanded as possible, short of being enlightened in the knowing yourself completely. And yet it allows you to stay in the world with some attachment. Why is that attachment necessary? Why complete non-attachment is not so good? Because if complete non-attachment happens, then you really only value that ultimate expansion. You don't value the world anymore. That value disappears. Because you have lost all the attachment for the worldly good. Outside world really does not matter anymore. To avoid that, until we can, the best way to serve the world is to avoid that state where I become completely indifferent. Although it's an indifference which is not a bad indifference. It's sometimes called high indifference. We're indifferent, but not in a bad way. Not in a negative way. There's negative indifference too. A person is begging and has nothing to eat, and you are negative about him. There are many people who are like that. Oh, poor people, they are incapable people. They are not able people. No need to deride like that, right? No need to do that. We can still appreciate the value that of another human being. Poor does not necessarily mean that the person is not capable, the person is not creative, person is not intelligent, person is stupid. The assumptions are not necessary, right? I can just be indifferent in a different way. And that's the indifference of the mystic. Mystic is indifferent in the sense that, okay, the helping or not helping, either way the person has some suffering in store and the person, but no value judgment. Person is suffering and person is suffering. I can still love the person, but of course I can do very limited amount. So what's the difference? If the person asks the enlightened, okay, then enlightened would respond with love. But otherwise, enlightened will not engage. You know, you cannot help someone who has not asked you for help. Enlightened person knows that. Enlightened person is always appropriate. So enlightened person will never go out of his or her way to help someone because the person is not asking. But if they ask, enlightened person would help. That's the difference between high indifference and low indifference. Low indifference is that we also judge. Enlightened person has no judgment. Very important distinction. Nevertheless, I suggest that we stay with the archetype of wholeness. So how do we get into wholeness? We avoid conflict. Wholeness is everywhere you see dichotomy, everywhere you see conflict, you integrate. At the very beginning, I said that the motivation of the quantum activist, one of the first motivation is to integrate thinking, living, and livelihood. Conflict between them really enormously destructive of our creativity, of our morale, of our will to live, of our satisfaction in living. So that's an integration. I just now spoke of another integration when we talked about personal growth. The spiritually enlightened, motivated, they don't bother about bringing their inner wealth at the service of the outer. But we do not want to be partial. We integrate inner and outer. We integrate creativity and conditioning. We don't give up the conditioned ego. We recognize that quantum self is the vehicle for creativity, creative insight, intuition, but we also recognize that we need the ego for giving form to what we intuit, what we create, what insight we get. The form does not come from the quantum self. The form comes from my know-how that I have in my brain, in my memory, in my personal unconscious, which the ego controls. So in this way, the three major integration that we do is, so I went through first inner outer, and then creativity conditioning, and we also talked about integrating thinking, living, and making a living. The final integration that I want to talk about is the male-female integration. This one is much misunderstood, and you got to avoid this misunderstanding. There is male-female difference, and there is good reason for it. Why is the male-female difference? Because sexuality becomes a huge force in our life. That male-female polarity helps intensify sexuality. See, look at the animals. Look at very lower level animals, and you'll see the difference. Animals have sexuality only to create progeny. So what happens? When the female will be in heat, then the male will copulate and they will make babies. Rest of the time, no. Right? Nothing. The sexual energy plays no role in the animal's life. Okay? Human beings are different. How different? Well, one difference is, of course, we have this pleasure circuit built into the brain. So we can use certainly sexuality for pleasure. Okay? Is there any other way that we can use sexuality? This is a trick that we are just learning. It has been discovered for quite some time, actually a couple of thousand years, in some parts of the world, like India and Tibet. But even they could not understand it very well. It has been corrupted. Because understanding sexuality is not that easy. It gets mixed up with these pleasure circuits that we have. It is a fact that our lower chakra activities, chakras I introduced yesterday, you remember, there is a chakra at the sexual organs called sex chakra, convenience sake. Sanskrit name is very complicated. Might as well call it by something we can remember. It's easy to remember. It's something that we never forget, either male or female. We remember our sexuality practically all the time, right? This is something that is with us. And yet, how poorly we use the sexual energy. How poorly indeed. Isn't that amazing? The polarity was made initially for the purpose of propagation. It's more efficient. Sexual reproduction changed into sexual reproduction because it gives more genetic variations. It's more efficient for the propagation of the species. So survival is helped initially. But now, does pleasure contribute to survival? Not in a very direct way. That's only the reproduction. And still, many conservative people, religious people, they believe that we should have sex only for reproduction. This is a major difference between whom we call liberal and whom we call conservative, right? Liberal idea is that no, we should use for pleasure. And of course, we all know that if we shut off pleasure, it's not a very good thing. Society has become weird. But is pleasure the end of it? Is that all? Freud, Freud, who studied sexuality a whole lot, towards the end of his life, he discovered the concept that sexuality can be sublimated. This was an interesting concept. Sexuality can be sublimated. What does that mean? His idea was that creative people somehow use the sexual energy and it becomes different. He called it libido. Of course, libido is understood by many people as just pleasure-seeking energy. That's, so there is division here. But some people interpret the word libido. Why did Freud use that special word, not lust, but libido? And the interpretation that is given, that Freud had the idea that maybe if we sublimate, the sexual energy changes. It becomes a motivation for creativity, becomes energy of life itself. Creativity becomes passionate. So even in the West, we had this concept. But I really want to tell you the concepts that came from India and Tibet somehow, and we now have begun to understand it with science. These concepts were very unclear before. I don't know if you have heard about these concepts. It's gradually coming into vogue. The idea is called Tantra, sometimes in spiritual literature, but much misunderstood because Tantra uses sexuality. And all kinds of very peculiar practices are used, and therefore it's much misunderstood. But the idea of Tantra is really the same idea as the Freudian idea. Can the sexual energy, which is abundant, right? Unless you were really grew up in a very constricted consciousness family, you know that the sexual energy is one of the biggest motivator, can be big motivator for human beings. And yet we throw it away for pleasure. So let's analyze pleasure. What is pleasure? Pleasure is a brain phenomenon. We have pleasure circuits. So what happens in the brain? Brain has these circuits in which neurons connect with another neuron, and in the process emits a molecule called neurotransmitter. There are 4 neurotransmitters, out of which one is the particularly pleasure-inducing molecule called dopamine. molecules. It's okay. Nothing wrong with molecules. Food is also molecule, right? We enjoy food. That's okay. So why not enjoy dopamine? That's okay. But where is consciousness in this? When dopamine is there, is consciousness necessarily elevated? All of you are adults, so we can talk about sexuality openly. So imagine you are having sex, okay? And you have an orgasm. Maximum dopamine. Okay? Now what? Usually the male tendency, because one of the things that happen after orgasm, male orgasm, is serotonin. Another neurotransmitter exists in the brain called serotonin. And this neurotransmitter induces sleep, relaxation. So the option for the male is twofold. One is to stay awake, other is to go to sleep. What is your tendency? If you stayed awake, your female partner would be quite happy. Females want that, right? This is the male-female difference, and this is what I'm getting at. These differences are important and recognize the polarity. So the female wants the male to stay in embrace. And if you do that, if the male could cooperate, then you find that indeed the afterglow of sex is something which is quite happiness producing. Expansion of consciousness in that sense. The molecules are gone. The molecules are already, the dopamine high is finished now. The male usually will have a slight negative experience after the orgasm. Only very slight. You have to notice that. You really have to be sensitive. But if you're sensitive, you'll notice that, oh, there is just a little bit disappointed feeling. But if you overcame the serotonin-induced sleep tendency and stayed in embrace with the female, you notice something very wonderful, that consciousness expands and brings you what you call happiness. But at the same time, that happiness comes with something that males don't like. And this is the interesting part. Males don't like because this expanded consciousness wants you to care for the other. And this caring, you wonder, will not make you vulnerable. Suppose she wants to get married tomorrow, or suppose you are already married, then she will want a car from you tomorrow, or a big necklace, or something expensive. Vulnerability, I'm joking, but not really. Not really. In the olden days, women knew about this, and they would always ask for household expenses after sex. You can ask your grandmother, or even your mother will know. This was a common trick that women used because men handled the purse. Women had no control over household money in those days. Not very long ago. I mean, all this cultural change, really very welcome change, but it only has taken place recently. Good or bad, I'm not making any value judgment. So, what if we try to understand what is going on? We're already understanding a little bit. So what if we completely use our science to understand this? It's so interesting. So we talked about the chakras. Here's the sex chakra. Here is the navel chakra. Here is the heart chakra. And here is the brow chakra. Throat chakra is here, but it won't be interesting in this discussion. So here the energy cannot actualize. Potentiality is there, but it cannot actualize because we don't have any self here. Self only is in the navel, in the heart, and in the brow. So the choice is to have the sex energy go into the navel and actualize there. Navel is our personal ego, body ego. Navel is the place where we experience security for me. Navel is also the place where we can be very me-centered. For the male, the problem is this me-centered narcissism is located in the navel. So the tendency for the male initially is definitely to actualize the sexual energy in the navel chakra at the service of the me. Female, on the other hand, culturally is not encouraged to have this so much me-centeredness. Females in all culture, because they eventually have to become mother, cultures recognize that, and therefore as a training of motherhood, they're always encouraged to enlarge their heart. This is why, on the average, yesterday when I asked, although very few people experienced any feelings in the body at all, but the few that did, most of the males had experience in the navel, and most of the women had experience in the heart. This is called male-female difference. Males have more acquaintance with the navel chakra. Women have more acquaintance with the heart chakra. So what happens for the woman is that the sexual energy will actualize here in the heart. So women like to use sex for love. Heart chakra is about love. And male like to use sex for power, personal power, narcissism, this kind of thing. See, if we look at in a scientific way, then we are understanding why males are a certain way in all cultures. And it's a huge problem of being a male. So indifferent to love. Of course, the female needs the male to have sexual pleasure, but what a wastage, because the male only uses the female for the personal aggrandizement, navel chakra, not for love. Right? But how much nicer it would be if the males discovered love. Look at the other side also. Other side is the female who is deprived from acknowledging that there is a place for personal power also in life. So females, in the absence of a strong navel chakra, what happens to them? They become needy over the male. So male never finds love, and the female never finds the personal power, that self-assurance. In the West, it's not so severe, but in the East, really, female gender suffers so much that's so loving and yet doesn't have any self-assurance at all, no self-respect. Always needs the male to do trivial things, taking care of life, trivial things. Only recently it is changing somewhat. This is why we need male-female integration, badly, in the West and in the East. Proper understanding of sexuality. Suppose the energy would not even be actualized neither in the heart or in the navel. Suppose you could take it all the way up to the brow. Imagine that. If our heart and navel is integrated, then we don't need to have the sexual energy serve these chakras. We can take it all the way up to the brow chakra. What happens then? This is what Freud was talking about. For creative people, they are so motivated towards the creativity, they are feeling horny, but there is no time for sexuality, no time for pleasure. Where would the energy go? By their desire of making the creative breakthrough, some of the energy will go up anyway and actualize in the brow chakra. This is what Freud discovered, and he called it sublimation. Can this happen in a very creative way? Yes, it can happen in a very creative way. I had an experience of rising sexual energy all the way into the brow chakra. And enormous amount of creativity opened up after that. Of course, I didn't know that immediately. I had no idea what happened immediately. I had to construct all the science, all the understanding after the event. But now that I understand it, it was an enormously rewarding experience. And it had produced visible change. Why can't all of us do that? Did the ancient know this for sure? They knew it so much that it's even mythologized. You know, when you have a truth, but the truth nobody believes, then what the culture does, the culture mythologizes that, makes a myth out of it. Because myths are the tellers of bigger truths, which people are misunderstanding in the current culture, but the hope is that somebody in the future will understand it better. What's the myth? Myth is this great god Shiva. You know about Shiva. If you know Indian culture, you know Shiva. And Shiva is a great yogi, meditates all the time. So Shiva is meditating, and the princess of the place, of the kingdom, she has fallen in love with Shiva. But Shiva pays no attention at all. But Parvati, the name of the girl, she comes every day and sits with Shiva because she finds enormous peace and love in his presence. Shiva just meditates. So one day, the god of love is going by, and god of love takes kindly over this very pretty young girl, pining away for Shiva, Shiva paying no attention, and so the god of love throws that Cupid's arrow of love. So indeed, Shiva's concentration is broken. Shiva looks at the girl, and of course sexual energy, and so he has his usual male bodily reaction, and so he's very embarrassed by it. I'm a yogi, how can I have this peculiar condition at the sight of a mere girl? Very embarrassed, and this embarrassment, the sexual energy rises and goes all the way to the brow chakra. And the saying is that the brow chakra becomes so hot that the god of love burns. So significance of the myth, what actually took place? significance of the myth is not very hard to find. It's the same idea as Freud's. The energy was sublimated, and what happened was that this brow chakra became activated. What does that mean? This activation of a chakra is a very interesting concept. It's also called opening of the chakra. Like when you allow your energy, which was usually being actualized in the navel for the male and the heart for the female, when you allow it to actualize here for the female and here for the male, then you can think of opening of these chakras. So what is happening is here, the energy was originally romantic love, and if now you allow the energy to rise, it will open further. So male will now have the ability of loving, period. And how important is that? Very, very important, right? Romantic love is built into us. Anybody can do what is built into us. It's an instinct. But to love someone is very special. That ability opens up. Female, likewise, did not have the ability of loving herself, but if the female learns to actualize the sexual energy in the navel chakra opens. That's the language that is used. What does that mean? Navel chakra originally is just about security, personal security. We eat, we feel secure. But now, it's more than that. We have love for myself, self-love. This self-love, self-respect, these are huge new things to feel, to have in your paraphernalia of experience. Self-love. When heart energy comes into the navel, self-love, self-respect. How can I love another without loving myself? It's just a very different form of love. And this ability I can have if I integrate the two chakras. Going back here, when this chakra opens, what was this chakra's function? Just rational thinking. Right behind it is the prefrontal cortex, the top part of the brain, prefrontal cortex. And that's where all the thinking, rational thinking happens. Instead now, we are capable of intuitive thinking. So this brow chakra is called the third eye. Another way of looking at the world, another way of cognizing the world has now opened up. Now I am free to intuit. This thing, this ability, which is extremely dormant in most human beings. Why don't scientists even like the idea of intuition? Because they don't have the experience. Why don't scientists like the idea of consciousness? Because their consciousness is always so constricted. Do you see? This is the problem with the world. They just don't experience consciousness the way mystics do, the way lovers do, the way women do, the way most of us are capable of, but we neglect it. If we could experience consciousness the way some of us do, then of course nobody could ignore consciousness the way it actually is. Instead of thinking consciousness is an object, they could realize very readily that no, consciousness is everything. Right? So similarly, when the third eye opens, then the world completely changes. We experience these archetypes. They come in profundity. They are always coming, but I'm not sensitive. Only rarely do I become sensitive. I see a person and I intuit love. That happens. I encounter a challenging problem. I want to find the truth. That happens. So we intuit occasionally these archetypes: truth, love, goodness. The artist senses beauty. We look at a flower, all of us sometimes get, how beautiful it is. We look at a sunset, we sense that archetype. The healers become interested in wholeness. They sense that archetype. I want to make people whole. People suffering, somehow I am bothered by it. I want to make this person whole. And this is why they come to the archetype of wholeness that shows healing. If you are not interested in the archetype of wholeness, healing is a difficult job. As a job, you could never be really a healer because it's so difficult to be concerned about somebody else. And look at these healers. They're concerned and they're actually helping. I mean, it's amazing. You look at a nurse, you look at doctors are a little different in this culture. You know, they have become quite objective and unconcerned sometimes. But really, especially look at the nurses, and they still represent the old culture. And you will see what I mean. So concerned. Amazing. How do they do it? Because they have that archetype driving them. Wholeness. Now I have to make this person whole. That means something to me. Then we can do it. And when the third eye opens, through every one of us, this archetype starts speaking in profundity. Now all these archetypes then come to us and we become interested. Archetypes. The highest context for living. Okay? So we take a break now, and when we come back and talk about creativity, how to investigate these archetypes. Thank you.